There is a special kind of silence in a courthouse. It's a heavy, judgmental hush that seems to absorb all hope. I walked through those marble halls, my cheap shoes squeaking on the polished floor, feeling smaller and more insignificant with every step. My name is Liam, and I was there to be officially, legally disowned. It was my parents' final move in a lifelong campaign to make me feel worthless. To them, I was the family disappointment. While my older brother, Ethan, was becoming a carbon copy of my father, a ruthless, successful corporate lawyer, I was the dreamer. The one who dropped out of business school to become a carpenter. The one who worked with his hands, smelling of sawdust and sweat instead of expensive cologne and ambition. The rift had been a canyon for years. But it became an uncrossable ocean when I refused to sell my small, thriving woodworking shop to help bail out my father's floundering real estate development. His project was overleveraged and unethical, bulldozing a historic neighborhood. I said no. That single word was my declaration of war. Their retaliation was swift and brutal. They cut me off financially, of course. But then they went further. They sued me. The case was absurd. They claimed the seed money for my shop, a $5,000 gift they'd given me for my 21st birthday, was actually a loan. A loan they were now calling in, with outrageous, fabricated interest. It was a petty, vicious power play designed to bankrupt me and force me to my knees. I reached the door of the courtroom. My hands were clammy. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open. And there they were. My mother, Eleanor, sat perfectly poised in a tailored cream suit, her blonde hair a helmet of perfection. My father, Robert, was a granite statue in a $5,000 suit, his arms crossed. And next to them, my brother Ethan, their prized pit bull, looking smug and prepared. As I walked down the center aisle, the sound of my entrance broke their quiet conversation. My mother turned. Her eyes, cold and blue as a glacier, swept over me, from my worn work boots to my off-the-rack, slightly too tight suit. And then she did something that froze the blood in my veins. She laughed. It wasn't a loud laugh. It was a soft, condescending, dismissive chuckle, accompanied by a roll of her eyes. She leaned over and whispered something to my father. He turned his head. He didn't laugh. His expression was one of pure, unadulterated disgust. He looked me up and down, and then he slowly, deliberately, shook his head in disappointment. The message was clear: look at you. You don't even know how to wear a suit properly. You are an embarrassment. In that moment, any last, fragile hope for reconciliation shattered. The love a son should feel for his parents was incinerated, replaced by a cold, hard ball of fury. They weren't just opposing me in court, they were mocking my very existence. I didn't react. I didn't flinch. I just walked to the defendant's table and sat down, my back straight, my face a mask of calm. The storm was raging inside me, but on the surface, I was still water. Their lawyer, a slick, smarmy man who was a perfect match for my brother, stood up and began his opening statement. He painted me as an ungrateful son, a financial leech who had taken advantage of my parents' generosity and was now refusing to pay his debts. He called my carpentry shop a hobby, a failed venture. My family nodded along, their faces masks of righteous agreement. Then, it was my turn. I was representing myself. I couldn't afford a lawyer, and frankly, I didn't want one. This was personal. I stood up. I could feel their mocking gazes on my back as I walked to the podium. The judge, an elderly woman with kind but weary eyes, looked down at me. "Mr. Thorne," she said. "You may begin." I looked directly at my parents. I held my mother's icy gaze and my father's contemptuous stare. "Your Honor," I began, my voice steady, despite the tremor in my hands. "My parents are suing me for a $5,000 birthday gift. They claim it was a loan. But that's not why we're here today. We're here today because I refuse to be like them." My father scoffed audibly. I refused to sell my integrity to fund my father's shady business deals. I refused to abandon a craft I loved to become a soulless clone of my brother. And for that refusal, they have decided to destroy me. My mother's smirk widened. She thought this was my pathetic, emotional plea. She thought I was breaking. "But this lawsuit," I continued, "is about more than money. It's about control. And my parents have miscalculated. They think they hold all the power. They think because they have money and status, they can dictate the terms of my life." I reached into the inner pocket of my ill-fitting suit jacket. I pulled out a single, sealed manila envelope. "They laughed when I walked in," I said, my voice dropping, becoming dangerously quiet. "They shook their heads in shame. But they have no idea what I've been building while they were busy counting their money." I held up the envelope. "The reason I revealed I was representing myself," I said, looking straight at my now confused parents, "isn't because I can't afford a lawyer." I paused, letting the silence stretch. "It's because the lawyer I hired is otherwise occupied. He's currently finalizing the acquisition of my father's company." The smirk vanished from my mother's face. My father's head snapped up, his eyes wide. "What is this nonsense?" my brother barked, standing up. I ignored him and handed the envelope to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. "Your Honor, contained in that envelope are documents proving that I am the majority shareholder of a shell company that has, over the last 6 months, been quietly purchasing the distressed debt of my father's flagship development, the Apex Tower. As of 9 a.m. this morning, we now hold controlling interest." The courtroom was utterly silent. "My father's company is drowning in debt," I explained, my voice echoing in the stillness. "He cut corners, used substandard materials, and bribed officials. The project is a house of cards. I didn't just buy his debt. I bought the evidence of his crimes. The bribes, the forged safety inspections, the environmental violations. It's all in there." My father was pale. He was gripping the table, his knuckles white. "I didn't want his company. I didn't want his money. I just wanted him to leave me alone to build beautiful things with my hands. But he pushed. So I pushed back. I turned to face my family fully. The revenge was no longer silent. It was a roar. "You sued me for $5,000, I said, my voice trembling not with fear, but with a lifetime of suppressed fury. "And in return, I just took everything from you." The moment I revealed why I was really there, the laughter was gone. The looks of disgust were replaced with looks of pure, undiluted horror. The tables had turned. And the sound of their world crumbling was the sweetest silence I had ever heard. The silence in the courtroom was broken by my father's guttural roar. "This is a lie. A fraudulent, malicious lie." The judge, her face a mask of stern shock, held up a hand. "Mr. Thorne, you will control yourself." She was already scanning the documents I had provided, her eyes moving rapidly across the pages filled with financial records, wire transfers, and damning emails my father had foolishly believed were deleted. My brother, Ethan, the lawyer, was frantically whispering to my father, his smugness replaced by panicked calculation. My mother was no longer a statue of icy elegance, she was a ghost, her hand pressed to her mouth, her eyes darting between me and my father as if watching a fatal car crash in slow motion. "Your Honor," Ethan spluttered, standing up. This is highly irregular. These documents cannot be admitted. This is a completely separate matter from the simple contract dispute we are here to." "It is the root of the dispute, Your Honor," I interrupted, my voice calm, a stark contrast to their chaos. "This lawsuit was never about a $5,000 gift. It was an act of retaliation because I would not participate in, and then threaten to expose, my father's criminal enterprise. I am providing context for the court, and evidence of a pattern of coercion and intimidation." The judge looked from my ashen-faced family back to me. "Mr. Thorne, the scope of this revelation is far beyond this small claims hearing. I am adjourning this case indefinitely and strongly recommending the plaintiffs drop their suit. Furthermore, I am duty-bound to forward these documents to the District Attorney's office and the Securities and Exchange Commission." It was over. Their petty lawsuit had just become the trigger for their total annihilation. My father stood up, his chair screeching behind him. He pointed a trembling finger at me. You ungrateful little. I built an empire." "You built a house of cards on a foundation of lies," I replied, my voice flat. "And I just blew it down." I didn't wait for their response. I turned and walked out of the courtroom. I didn't look back. The sound of my mother's beginning sobs and my father's enraged sputtering was the soundtrack of my victory. The revenge, however, was only beginning. The public fallout was swift and brutal. By that evening, the story was on the financial news channels: real estate titan Robert Thorne under investigation, company seized by mystery buyer. The mystery buyer was me, operating through the shell company I'd named Phoenix Holdings. I didn't do it for the money. I did it for the principle. And for the people. The Apex Tower wasn't just a building, it was a death trap. The corrupted safety inspections, the substandard concrete, it was a tragedy waiting to happen. My first act as the new majority owner was to halt all construction and order a full, independent structural review. I then went to the local news, not as a vengeful son, but as a concerned citizen who had uncovered a grave public danger. The narrative in the press was perfect. I was the humble carpenter's son who had exposed his powerful father's corruption to save lives. My father was the greedy villain. My mother and brother were his complicit accomplices. A week after the courtroom scene, I was in my woodshop, the scent of cedar and lemon oil a comfort, when the bell above the door chimed. I looked up. It was my mother. She looked ordinary. Dressed in simple slacks and a sweater, no makeup, her perfect hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. The armor was gone. She looked frail and lost. "Liam," she said, her voice a ragged whisper. I put down my chisel but didn't speak. I just waited. "The FBI, they raided the house. They took your father's computers, his files. Ethan's law license is under review. Our assets are frozen." She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering though the shop was warm. We have nothing. I felt a pang of something, not pity, but a distant sorrow for the woman she could have been. You have each other, I said, my tone devoid of emotion. Tears streamed down her face. He's not well. The shame, the rage, he won't leave his study. He just stares. That sounds familiar, I said softly, thinking of the years I'd spent feeling the exact same way under their roof. She flinched. Liam, please. You've won. You've destroyed him. Isn't that enough? Can't you let it go? We're your family. That word. Family. It had lost all meaning. You stopped being my family the moment you laughed at me in that courtroom, I said, my voice quiet but absolute. You made your choice. You bet on the wrong son. You bet on greed and power. I bet on integrity. And it turns out, integrity is the more valuable asset. What do you want from us? She cried, her composure finally shattering. Nothing, I said, and it was the truth. I don't want your money. I don't want your apology. I don't want a relationship. I just want you to live with the consequences of the people you chose to be. That is my silent revenge. You have to live in the ruin you built, while I get to keep building. I turned my back on her and picked up my chisel again, running my thumb along its sharp, clean edge. The message was clear, the conversation was over. I heard a soft, broken sob, the sound of the door opening and closing, and then she was gone. The revenge was complete. It wasn't just about taking my father's company. It was about holding up a mirror so they could see the monstrous reflection of their own souls. It was about proving that the son they thought was weak was, in fact, the strongest of them all. I had entered that courtroom as the family disappointment. I walked out as the architect of their ruin. And in my quiet woodshop, surrounded by the honest smell of real wood, I was finally, truly, free. The months that followed were a study in quiet aftermath. My father was formally indicted on multiple counts of fraud, bribery, and violating building codes. The media circus was relentless. His empire, the source of his identity and his power over us, was dismantled brick by brick. He pled guilty, avoiding a trial, and was sentenced to a federal prison. The mighty Robert Thorne was reduced to an inmate number. My brother, Ethan, was disbarred. His reputation was so thoroughly entangled with our father's crimes that he became unemployable in the legal world. He and his wife moved to another state, a quiet, shameful retreat. The golden child had tarnished irrevocably. My mother, stripped of her wealth and social status, moved into a small apartment. The few friends she had from her country club life vanished. She was alone with the ghost of the life she had chosen. I followed it all from a distance, through news articles and the occasional update from my grandmother. I felt no joy, only a profound, hollow sense of closure. The storm had passed, and the landscape of my life was permanently altered. I didn't keep my father's company. Once the structural review of the Apex Tower was complete, confirming it was indeed a death trap, I worked with the courts and creditors to responsibly dismantle the corporation. I used my position to ensure the subcontractors, the little guys my father had routinely stiffed, were paid what they were owed from the remaining assets. The name Thorne Enterprises was dissolved, scrubbed from the city's skyline forever. With the legal and financial war over, I returned to my life. But it was a different life. The quiet carpenter was gone. I was now the man who had taken down a tycoon. My woodworking shop, once a humble refuge, was now inundated with orders. People wanted a piece of furniture from the guy with a backbone. I hired 2 apprentices to help with the demand, but my heart wasn't in the celebrity. It was in the craft. One rainy afternoon, I was working on a custom cherrywood desk, the rhythmic sound of my plane shaving thin curls of wood a meditation, when my grandmother stopped by. Nana Rose was the only family member who had never judged me, the one who had secretly lent me books on business and ethics when I was a teenager. You've created quite the mess, my boy, she said, settling onto a stool with a sigh, her eyes twinkling. I didn't create it, Nana. I just exposed it. Semantics, she said, waving a dismissive hand. The point is, it's done. The question is, what will you build from the rubble? I looked around my shop, at the stacks of wood, the finished pieces waiting for delivery. I'm building this. No, she said, her voice soft but firm. This is what you do. It's not what you are. You have a talent, Liam. Not just for wood, but for seeing the truth in things. For seeing the rot before the whole structure falls. That's a gift. And a gift isn't a gift until you give it away. Her words settled deep inside me. She was right. The revenge was over, but the purpose was just beginning. I started small. I began offering free workshops for at-risk kids, teaching them basic woodworking. The focus wasn't on creating master craftsmen, but on teaching patience, precision, and the profound satisfaction of creating something tangible with your own hands. I called it the Foundation Workshop. The name was a quiet joke on the rotten foundation I'd uncovered. The program was a success. It was featured in a local paper, and then a national magazine. Donations started trickling in. I used the money to buy more tools, to rent a bigger space, to hire a real teacher. One day, a woman came to the workshop, holding the hand of a shy, 10-year-old boy. She was one of the former residents of the neighborhood my father had tried to bulldoze for the Apex Tower. "I read about you," she said, her eyes holding a complex mixture of gratitude and sadness. I wanted to thank you. For stopping it. And for doing this." She gestured to the workshop, where a group of kids were laughing as they sanded birdhouses. Her son, looking at the tools with wide eyes, looked up at me. "Did you really beat the bad guy?" he asked. I knelt down so I was at his eye level. "I just made sure the truth got out," I said. "The truth is the most powerful tool there is." He nodded, a serious expression on his young face, and then ran off to join the others. In that moment, I understood the true shape of my revenge. It wasn't my father's imprisonment or my family's disgrace. It was this. It was the desk I was building for a single mother who'd finally gotten her GED. It was the birdhouse in a child's hands. It was a new foundation, built not on greed and lies, but on integrity and hope. The revenge had silenced the voices that told me I was worthless. But the legacy I was building? That was my voice, finally speaking its truth. And it was louder than their laughter would ever be. 5 years later, the Foundation Workshop was a citywide institution. We had programs in a dozen community centers, teaching hundreds of kids a year. We'd even partnered with the city to restore old parks, building new benches and picnic tables, leaving a tangible mark of beauty and care on the world. I was no longer the carpenter who took down his father. I was just Liam, the guy who ran the workshop. I had built a life of quiet purpose, a life so full there was no room for the ghosts of the past. Then, a letter arrived. It was from my mother. Her handwriting, once bold and commanding, was now shaky and thin. "Liam, your father is being released next month. He is sick. The doctors say his heart is failing. He has asked, once, if he could see you. I told him not to hope for it, but a wife must deliver her husband's messages. He is a broken man, in more ways than one. The choice, of course, is yours." Mom, I held the letter for a long time, the paper feeling fragile in my rough, calloused hands. I felt no anger. No hatred. Just a distant, weary sadness. The revenge was so far in the past it felt like a story about someone else. I didn't know if I wanted to see him. I didn't know if I owed him anything. But Nana Rose's words came back to me, "What will you build from the rubble?" A month later, I drove to the small, rented house where my mother lived. I stood on the porch, my heart a steady, calm drum, and knocked. My mother opened the door. She looked old. Truly old. The years of shame and solitude had carved deep lines into her face. But her eyes were clearer, softer than I had ever seen them. "Liam," she breathed, her voice full of a surprise that broke my heart a little. "I got your letter," I said. She nodded and stepped aside to let me in. The house was small and clean, furnished with simple, second-hand pieces. And there, in a worn armchair by the window, sat my father. He was a shell. The imposing, granite-faced man was gone, replaced by a frail, shrunken figure with sallow skin and trembling hands. He looked up as I entered, and his eyes, the same blue as mine, held no contempt, no arrogance. Just a bottomless well of regret. We stared at each other in the quiet room. The silence was heavy with all the words we had never said. "Liam," he rasped. "Father." He gestured weakly to the chair opposite him. Saturday, I'm dying," he said, the words blunt, stripped of all pretense. I heard. He looked out the window, at the small, unkempt garden. "I've had a lot of time to think. In that place. I thought about empires. About legacies." He let out a bitter, wheezing laugh. "I built one out of sand. And you," he finally looked at me, and a single tear traced a path through his wrinkled cheek. "You built one out of wood. Something real. Something that will last." I said nothing. I just let him talk. This was his confession, his final reckoning. "I was wrong," he whispered, the words seeming to cost him a great effort. "About everything. About business. About family. About you. I thought strength was in dominating. You taught me that strength is in integrity. I am so sorry, son. For all of it." It was the apology I had stopped waiting for. It didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a weight being lifted from both of us. "I forgive you," I said. And I meant it. Not for him, but for me. To finally be free of the burden of carrying his hatred. He closed his eyes, a look of profound relief washing over his ravaged face. He reached a trembling hand toward a small, cloth-wrapped bundle on the table beside him. "This is for you," he said. "I've been whittling. In prison. It passes the time." I took the bundle and unwrapped it. Inside was a small, clumsily carved wooden bird. The cuts were uneven, the sanding rough. It was the honest, imperfect work of a beginner. But it was the first true, beautiful thing my father had ever made with his hands. My eyes filled with tears. In that simple, flawed little bird, I saw it all. His failure. His regret. His futile, final attempt to connect with the son he never understood. I looked from the wooden bird to my father's broken body, to my mother's hopeful, grieving face. The revenge was complete, but it had transformed. It was no longer about their punishment. It was about my peace. I had taken the rotten timber of my family and, through fire and force of will, carved out a life of meaning. I had walked into that courtroom seeking validation. I walked out of my parents' house having given the one thing they truly needed, forgiveness. And in the end, that was the most silent, and most powerful, revenge of all. The greatest revenge is not in the ruin you leave behind, but in the peace you build for yourself. It's in taking the pain they inflicted and using it not as a weapon, but as a chisel to carve out a life of such profound integrity that their hatred becomes irrelevant. You won not by destroying them, but by becoming untouchable. This has been Silent Revenge.